The letter in Rebecca Walsh's trembling hands bore water stains from the tears she couldn't stop shedding, and the return address of Clearwater Valley, Montana Territory seemed as distant as the moon itself. Inside the burned-out shell of what had once been the Harper family cabin, 7 pairs of eyes stared at her with a mixture of desperate hope and resigned despair that broke something fundamental in her chest. This wasn't what she'd signed up for. This wasn't the new life she'd imagined when she'd answered that carefully worded advertisement in the Boston Herald, seeking a gentlewoman of good character for matrimonial correspondence with established rancher. But sometimes life has a way of demanding more courage than we think we possess, and sometimes the worst disasters become the doorway to the greatest blessings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Ann Walsh had never imagined her life would come to this, standing in the smoking ruins of a stranger's cabin, responsible for 7 children she'd never met, while her intended husband lay buried in the cemetery she'd passed on the way into Clearwater Valley. The journey from Boston had taken 3 weeks, each mile carrying her further from everything familiar and closer to what she'd hoped would be a fresh start. The advertisement had been simple enough. Widowed rancher seeks correspondence with woman of good character, object matrimony. Must be willing to relocate to Montana Territory. Children welcome. She'd written to Thomas Harper with the careful optimism of a woman who'd spent 5 years caring for her invalid mother, watching her own chances for marriage and family slip away with each passing season. At 28, Rebecca had resigned herself to spinsterhood until Thomas's letters began arriving, filled with descriptions of vast skies, rolling grasslands, and the kind of life she'd only read about in novels. His letters had painted pictures of a modest but comfortable ranch house, a successful cattle operation, and most importantly, his 5 children who needed a mother's care. What he hadn't mentioned was the drought that had plagued the territory for 2 years running, the failing crops, the mounting debts, or the desperation that had driven him to seek a mail-order bride as a solution to problems that ran deeper than loneliness. Rebecca had arrived in Clearwater Valley on a Tuesday morning in late September, her trunk packed with her best dresses and her mother's china, her heart full of nervous excitement about meeting the man whose letters had convinced her to risk everything on an unknown future. Instead of Thomas Harper waiting at the station, she'd found Sheriff Daniel Mitchell with his hat in his hands and words that shattered her carefully constructed dreams. "Miss Walsh, I'm afraid I have difficult news. Thomas Harper passed away 4 days ago. Pneumonia took him sudden-like. We've been trying to figure out how to reach you, but your train was already en route." The children were living in what remained of the cabin after a kitchen fire had gutted most of the structure 2 weeks before Thomas's death. The oldest, a boy named Samuel, who couldn't have been more than 14, had been trying to care for his siblings while managing what was left of the failing ranch. The youngest, a little girl named Hope, who looked no more than 4, clung to a tattered doll with eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so small. Between Samuel and Hope were 5 other children, each bearing the hollow-cheeked look of prolonged hunger and the resigned acceptance of children who'd learned not to expect much from the world. There was Martha, 12, who tried to mother the younger ones with fierce determination. Twin boys, Joseph and Joshua, aged 10, whose mischievous energy had been dimmed by circumstances. 8-year-old Catherine, who spoke in whispers and startled at sudden movements. And 6-year-old David, who had withdrawn so completely into himself that he rarely spoke at all. The cabin, that should have been Rebecca's new home, was barely habitable. The fire had destroyed the kitchen, most of the furniture, and all of the family's winter supplies. What remained was a main room with soot-stained walls, 2 small bedrooms that leaked when it rained, and a makeshift cooking area that Samuel had rigged up outside using salvaged pots and an open fire. The children had been surviving on cornmeal mush, wild berries, and whatever small game Samuel could catch with his father's old rifle. Sheriff Mitchell explained the situation with the uncomfortable air of a man delivering bad news he'd rather avoid. Thomas Harper had died owing money to nearly every merchant in town. The bank held the mortgage on the ranch, which was already 3 months behind in payments. There were no relatives willing or able to take in 7 orphaned children, and the nearest orphanage was in Helena, a 3-day journey that would likely separate the siblings permanently. "The thing is, Miss Walsh," Sheriff Mitchell continued, adjusting his hat nervously, "these children don't have anywhere to go. The county doesn't have resources for this kind of situation, and breaking up the family ... Well, it doesn't sit right with anyone. But winter's coming, and they can't survive in that cabin much longer." Rebecca stared at the ruins of what should have been her new home, trying to process the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen these children. She'd come west expecting to marry a widower with 5 children, prepared to step into the role of stepmother and helpmate. Instead, she found herself confronting a tragedy that demanded far more than she'd ever imagined giving. The practical voice in her head cataloged all the reasons she should take the next train back to Boston. She had no legal obligation to these children, no resources to care for them, no experience managing a failing ranch or nursing starving children back to health. Her savings, intended to help establish her new household, wouldn't last a month. Feeding 7 growing children. She didn't know the first thing about cattle ranching, crop management, or surviving a Montana winter, but the louder voice in her heart saw something else entirely. She saw Samuel's shoulders squared with determination despite his obvious exhaustion, as he tried to be the man his father's death had forced him to become. She saw Martha's gentle hands as she braided little Hope's tangled hair, providing what comfort she could despite her own grief. She saw the way the twins stayed close together, drawing strength from their shared bond in a world that had become unpredictable and frightening. Most of all, she saw herself reflected in their circumstances. She knew what it felt like to face an uncertain future alone, to wake up each morning wondering if this would be the day everything fell apart completely. The difference was that she'd had choices, however limited. These children had none. That first night, Rebecca slept on the floor of the main room, sharing her traveling blanket with Hope and Catherine, while listening to the sound of rain dripping through the damaged roof into buckets Samuel had strategically placed around the room. The little girls pressed close to her sides, seeking warmth and comfort from the only adult who'd shown them kindness in weeks. Their trust was both heartbreaking and terrifying. They were depending on her to solve problems she didn't understand with resources she didn't possess. Morning brought the stark reality of their situation into sharper focus. The children had been surviving on half rations for so long that they'd grown accustomed to constant hunger. Their clothes were patched and repatched, outgrown and worn thin. The boys' shoes had holes that let in water and cold, while the girls made do with hand-me-downs that had seen better days years ago. Rebecca used the last of her traveling money to buy supplies from the general store, acutely aware of the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed her movements through town. The story of the mail-order bride who'd arrived to find her intended husband dead and his children destitute was the kind of gossip that spread quickly in a small community. Some looks held sympathy, others barely concealed judgment about her situation and what it might mean for the children's future. The storekeeper, a kindly man named William Patterson, extended credit when Rebecca's money ran out, but she could see the concern in his eyes as he tallied up the debt she was accumulating. Flour, bacon, beans, milk for the youngest children. The basics of survival came with a price that highlighted just how precarious their situation had become. "Miss Walsh," Patterson said quietly as he wrapped her purchases, "I don't mean to pry, but do you have a plan? Winter comes early here, and those children, well, they've been through enough." Rebecca met his gaze directly, drawing on reserves of confidence she didn't feel. "We'll manage, Mr. Patterson. Children are resilient, and there's always a way forward if you're willing to work for it. But privately, she wondered if her optimism was dangerously naive. The Harper Ranch was failing, the children were malnourished, winter was approaching, and she was a city-bred woman with no experience in frontier survival. Every practical consideration suggested that the children would be better off in an orphanage, however heartbreaking the separation might be. It was Martha who changed everything. That evening, as Rebecca struggled to prepare a meal over the outdoor fire that Samuel had taught her to manage, the 12-year-old girl approached with the kind of serious expression that belonged on someone much older. "Miss Rebecca," Martha said carefully, "Samuel and I have been talking. We know you don't have to stay. We know this isn't what you came here for. But if you could just stay until we figure something else out, we promise we won't be any trouble. We can work. We can help. We just need a little more time." The carefully controlled composure that Rebecca had been maintaining crumbled in the face of Martha's quiet dignity. Here was a child trying to negotiate for her family's survival, offering labor and good behavior in exchange for the basic security that should have been her birthright. The injustice of it ignited something fierce and protective in Rebecca's chest. "Martha," she said firmly, kneeling to meet the girl's eyes directly, "you listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. We're going to figure this out together, all of us. This is your home. These are your brothers and sisters, and I'm not about to let anyone separate this family." The relief that flooded Martha's face was immediately followed by worry. "But Miss Rebecca, how? Papa owed money everywhere, and the bank man came by yesterday asking about the mortgage payments. Samuel's been trying to keep up with the ranch work, but there's so much he doesn't know, and winter's coming, and we'll take it one problem at a time," Rebecca interrupted gently. "First, we make sure everyone has enough to eat and a warm place to sleep. Then we figure out how to keep the ranch running. Then we deal with the debts and the bank. We don't have to solve everything today." But even as she spoke the words, Rebecca wondered if she was making promises she couldn't keep. The magnitude of the challenges facing them seemed insurmountable, and her own resources were already stretched to the breaking point. She was one woman with 7 children depending on her, facing a Montana winter in a burned-out cabin with mounting debts and a failing ranch. That night, as she listened to the children's quiet breathing around her, Rebecca made a decision that would change all their lives. She couldn't marry Thomas Harper as planned, but she could honor the commitment she'd made when she'd chosen to come west. She could be the mother these children desperately needed, the protector who would stand between them and a world that seemed determined to break them apart. The decision terrified her, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving or enduring, she was fighting for something that mattered more than her own comfort or security. She was fighting for a family that had chosen to trust her with their future, and she would not let them down. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems that demanded solutions she didn't yet know how to find. But tonight, for the first time since arriving in Clearwater Valley, Rebecca Walsh felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca's third morning in Clearwater Valley dawned gray and bitter, with frost covering the makeshift camp they'd created outside the damaged cabin. She woke to find little Hope shivering beside her, despite being wrapped in every blanket they could find. The child's lips had a bluish tinge that sent panic racing through Rebecca's chest. They couldn't survive many more nights like this. Samuel was already awake, crouched over the dying embers of their fire, trying to coax enough flame to heat water for the youngest children. At 14, he carried himself with the rigid responsibility of someone forced to grow up too quickly, but Rebecca could see the exhaustion weighing down his shoulders like a physical burden. "Morning's getting colder," he said without looking up. his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Won't be long before the real snow starts. Papa always said October snow in Montana means a hard winter's coming. Rebecca pulled Hope closer, feeling the little girl's body heat slowly returning. As they shared warmth around them, the other children were beginning to stir. Martha automatically reaching to check on David and Catherine, the twins huddling together for warmth, all of them moving with the careful quiet of people who'd learned not to complain about circumstances beyond their control. The reality of their situation hit Rebecca with fresh force each morning. 7 children depending on her for survival, a damaged cabin that wouldn't protect them from winter weather, mounting debts that threatened to take away even this inadequate shelter, and her own dwindling resources that might last another week if she was careful. "Samuel," she said quietly, not wanting to wake the others completely, "show me the ranch, all of it. I need to understand what we're working with." He looked up from the fire, surprise flickering across his features. Most adults had been asking what the family would do next, not what they had to work with. "Yes, ma'am. But there ain't much left that's worth much." They left Martha in charge of the younger children and walked the boundaries of what had once been Thomas Harper's dream. The ranch encompassed nearly 300 acres of rolling grassland, with a creek running through the southern section that provided year-round water for livestock. Even in its current state, Rebecca could see the potential that had drawn Thomas west: good grazing land, natural windbreaks, and a location close enough to town for practical purposes, but far enough away for privacy. The problems were equally obvious. The barn had a roof that leaked in 3 places, fencing that needed extensive repairs, and a water system that had been jury-rigged with parts that looked ready to fail. Most of the cattle had been sold off during the previous year to pay debts, leaving only a handful of the hardiest animals that Samuel had managed to keep alive through his own determination. "Papa bought this place with big dreams," Samuel explained, as they examined the damaged barn. "Said it would be something to pass down to all of us kids. But the drought hit right after we moved here, and then Mama got sick, and the medical bills." He trailed off, kicking at a loose board with obvious frustration. "How many cattle are left?" Rebecca asked, running her hand along a fence post that wobbled when touched. 18 head, maybe 20 if you count the ones that wandered off. Not enough to make any real money. But Papa always said you hold on to breeding stock no matter what. Said that's how you rebuild when times get better." Rebecca nodded, filing away information while her mind worked through possibilities she wasn't ready to voice yet. "What about the crops? The fields I saw on the way in?" Samuel's expression grew darker. "Total loss this year. Not enough rain. And the irrigation system Papa was building never got finished. Ground's too hard now to plant anything before spring, even if we had seed money." They spent the morning cataloging assets and problems, with the methodical thoroughness of people conducting an inventory of hope. The ranch had good bones, solid land, adequate water rights, and infrastructure that could be repaired rather than rebuilt. But it also had debts that exceeded its current value, no operating capital, and the coming winter that would make any improvement efforts impossible until spring. It was while they were examining the creek that ran through the southern pasture that everything changed. Rebecca heard hoofbeats approaching and looked up to see a rider coming toward them across the grassland, a man on a large bay horse, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in the saddle. "That's Marcus Whitman," Samuel said, and something in his tone made Rebecca look at him sharply. "Owns the biggest spread in the county. Been trying to buy our land since Papa died." The man who dismounted and approached them was perhaps 35. Tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of someone who worked his own land. His clothes were practical rather than fancy, but everything about him suggested prosperity and competence. When he removed his hat, Rebecca saw dark hair with touches of gray at the temples and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Morning, Samuel," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of managing men and making difficult decisions. "Miss Walsh, I assume. I'm Marcus Whitman. I was sorry to hear about Thomas's passing. He was a good neighbor and a decent man." Rebecca found herself studying Marcus Whitman with the same careful attention she'd been giving to the ranch's problems. Unlike the other men she'd encountered in Clearwater Valley, he didn't look at her with the mixture of pity and curiosity that had become familiar. Instead, his assessment felt respectful, as if he was trying to understand her rather than judge her circumstances. "Mr. Whitman," she replied, extending her hand with the directness her mother had always called unladylike. "I understand you've expressed interest in purchasing this property." His handshake was firm without being presumptuous, and he didn't hold her hand longer than necessary. "I have, though I suspect my timing might seem inappropriate given recent events. I came by today to make sure you and the children were managing all right, not to discuss business." Samuel shifted uncomfortably beside Rebecca, and she sensed undercurrents in the conversation that she didn't fully understand yet. "That's thoughtful of you. As you can see, we're adjusting to circumstances." Marcus's eyes moved over the damaged barn, the makeshift living arrangements visible in the distance, and Samuel's too thin frame with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Winter's coming early this year. These mountains don't forgive folks who aren't prepared for the cold." The statement wasn't a threat, but it carried weight nonetheless. Rebecca felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being reminded of problems she couldn't solve, but she kept her voice steady. "We're aware of the challenges. Samuel's been showing me the property, helping me understand what we're working with. And what have you concluded?" Marcus asked, but his tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Rebecca made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. That this is good land with potential that hasn't been fully realized. That the current difficulties are temporary setbacks rather than permanent failures. And that 7 children deserve the chance to grow up on the land their father chose for them. Something shifted in Marcus Whitman's expression, a flicker of what might have been approval or recognition. "That's an optimistic assessment, Miss Walsh. Do you have experience with ranch management?" "None whatsoever," Rebecca admitted with a directness that made Samuel stare at her in alarm. "But I have experience with solving problems, managing resources, and refusing to give up when things seem impossible. Those skills transfer to any situation that requires determination and careful planning." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Rebecca wonder what he was seeing. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, less formal, more personal. "Miss Walsh, would you and Samuel be willing to ride over to my place? There's something I'd like to show you, and a proposition I'd like to discuss. Nothing that commits you to anything, just ... an alternative you might want to consider." Rebecca looked at Samuel, reading the confusion and wariness in his expression. The boy had lived through enough false promises and disappointed hopes to be suspicious of any offer that seemed too good to be true. But there was also something else in his face, a desperate hope that he was trying not to let himself feel. "What kind of proposition?" Rebecca asked carefully. "The kind that might solve several problems at once, if everyone involved is willing to approach the situation practically rather than conventionally." Marcus put his hat back on, shading his eyes but not hiding the seriousness of his expression. "I'm not talking about charity, Miss Walsh. I'm talking about a business arrangement that could benefit all parties involved." The ride to the Whitman ranch took nearly an hour, giving Rebecca time to observe both the countryside and her companion. Marcus rode with the easy competence of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, but he also took care to keep his pace comfortable for Samuel and to point out landmarks and features of the landscape that might be useful for Rebecca to know. His ranch was everything the Harper place could become: well-maintained buildings, healthy livestock, fields that showed evidence of successful crop rotation, and an overall sense of prosperity built through years of careful management. The main house was large but not ostentatious, built from local stone and timber with wide porches that suggested comfort rather than display. "Impressive," Rebecca said as they dismounted in front of the barn, and she meant it. This was what Thomas Harper had been trying to build, what he might have achieved if circumstances had been different. 15 years of work, Marcus replied, but there was satisfaction rather than boasting in his tone. "My father started this place, but it's taken time to build it into something sustainable." He led them to a corral where several horses moved with the easy grace of well-cared-for animals. "Samuel, what do you think of that bay mare? The one with the white markings?" Samuel's eyes lit up with the first genuine enthusiasm Rebecca had seen from him. "She's beautiful. Good lines, looks like she's got spirit, but not meanness." "She does. Broke her myself last spring. She's fast, smart, and gentle enough for children to handle once they learn proper horsemanship." Marcus leaned against the fence, watching Samuel study the horse with obvious appreciation. "Thing is, I've got more horses than I can properly exercise, and that mare needs regular riding to stay in condition." Rebecca began to sense where this conversation was heading, but she waited for Marcus to continue rather than jumping to conclusions. "Miss Walsh," he said, turning to face her directly, "I'm going to make you an offer that might sound unusual, but I hope you'll hear me out completely before making any decisions." "I'm listening." "I need help managing this operation." "Good help. The kind of person who can handle multiple responsibilities, make decisions under pressure, and work with both people and livestock. Someone who understands that running a successful ranch requires attention to details that most folks overlook." Rebecca felt her heart begin to beat faster, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of help?" "A partner. Someone who could manage the household operations, help with the business side of things, and—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Provide the kind of stability that children need to grow up properly." The implications of his offer hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Marcus Whitman wasn't just offering her employment, he was offering her a solution to every problem that had seemed insurmountable that morning. A home for the children, financial security, the chance to keep the Harper family together, and work that would allow her to contribute meaningfully rather than simply surviving on charity. "Mr. Whitman," she said carefully, "are you proposing marriage?" His smile was slight but genuine. "I'm proposing a partnership, Miss Walsh. Marriage would be the legal framework that makes everything else possible. But I'm not talking about romance or promises that neither of us might be able to keep. I'm talking about two adults working together to solve practical problems and build something worthwhile." Samuel was staring at both of them with an expression that cycled through disbelief, hope, and careful wariness. Rebecca could almost see him trying to understand whether this offer was real, whether it was something that could actually happen, whether he dared to believe that their desperate situation might have a solution that didn't involve losing everything he cared about. "What about the Harper Ranch?" Rebecca asked. "The children's inheritance, part of the arrangement," Marcus replied promptly. "We'd combine the operations, pay off the existing debts, and develop both properties as a single enterprise. When the children come of age, they'd inherit their parents' land as planned, but it would be profitable land rather than a burden they couldn't manage." Rebecca's mind raced through implications and possibilities. Marcus Whitman was offering her everything she'd hoped to find when she'd answered Thomas Harper's advertisement: a home, a family, meaningful work, and financial security. But he was also offering something more: respect for her abilities, a genuine partnership rather than dependence, and the chance to save 7 children who had no other options. "This is very sudden," she said finally. "I don't know anything about you beyond what I can observe. You don't know anything about me beyond a 20-minute conversation. How can you be certain this arrangement would work?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving from Rebecca to Samuel and back again. "Miss Walsh, I've been watching how you've handled the situation since you arrived. I've seen how those children respond to you, how you've taken responsibility for problems that weren't your making, how you've approached impossible circumstances with dignity and determination. Those are the qualities that matter in a partner." He paused, then continued with the kind of honesty that takes courage. "I've been alone on this ranch for 3 years since my wife died. I've built something successful, but it's not complete. It needs the kind of attention and care that I can't provide on my own. You need security and a future for those children. Sometimes the best partnerships are built on practical needs rather than romantic ideals." Rebecca looked around the prosperous ranch, thought about the 7 children waiting for her in the ruins of their burned cabin, considered the impossible challenges they faced alone versus the possibilities that Marcus Whitman was offering. It was a leap of faith that required her to trust a stranger with not just her own future, but the futures of 7 children who had already suffered too much loss. But as she watched Samuel's careful hope, as she thought about little Hope shivering in the prigone cold, as she calculated the impossibility of surviving the coming winter without help, Rebecca Walsh made the second life-changing decision of her young life. "Mr. Whitman," she said, extending her hand with the same directness she'd shown earlier, "I believe we have an arrangement to discuss." The conversation that followed Marcus Whitman's proposal took place in his study, a room lined with ledger books and ranch records that spoke of meticulous attention to business details. Rebecca sat across from his desk while Samuel perched uncomfortably on a leather chair that had clearly seen years of use, both of them trying to process an offer that seemed almost too good to be true. "Before we discuss specifics," Marcus said, opening a leather-bound ledger, "I want you to understand exactly what you'd be agreeing to. This isn't charity, Miss Walsh. It's a business proposition that requires equal contribution from both parties." Rebecca appreciated his directness, even as it made her stomach clench with nervous energy. "What kind of contribution would you expect from me?" "Complete management of household operations for both ranches. That means planning meals for up to 15 people during busy seasons, managing household budgets, overseeing food preservation for winter, and coordinating the domestic staff." Marcus's finger traced down a column of figures as he spoke. "You'd also handle correspondence with suppliers, maintain inventory records, and manage the books for household expenses." The scope of responsibility was staggering, far beyond anything Rebecca had imagined when she'd agreed to become Thomas Harper's wife. But it was also the kind of work that utilized skills she'd developed during years of managing her mother's household, expanded to a scale that actually mattered. "What about the children?" Samuel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Rebecca could hear the underlying tension. This was the question that mattered most to him, the answer that would determine whether Marcus Whitman's offer was salvation or simply another form of displacement. Marcus turned his attention to Samuel with the same seriousness he'd shown Rebecca. "They'd live here, all of them. This house has enough bedrooms, and we'd add more if needed. They have chores appropriate to their ages, education, either through the town school or private tutoring, and the same expectations I'd have for any children in my household." "What kind of expectations?" Rebecca asked, needing to understand the full picture before she could make any decisions. "Honesty, hard work, respect for others, and the understanding that this ranch operates as a family enterprise where everyone contributes according to their abilities." Marcus closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair. "I'm not looking to be a disciplinarian or a taskmaster, Miss Walsh, but I do expect children to learn responsibility and develop the skills they'll need as adults." Rebecca found herself studying Marcus Whitman's face, trying to read the man behind the practical words. His offer addressed every immediate crisis they faced, but it also represented a fundamental change in her relationship with the children. She would no longer be their protector struggling to keep them safe. She would be their stepmother in a functioning household, with resources and stability. "The Harper Ranch," she said carefully. "You mentioned combining operations. How would that work in practice?" Marcus opened a different ledger, this one filled with maps and property surveys. "The Harper land borders mine on the eastern boundary. Combined, we have over 800 acres of grazing land, 2 creeks, and enough diversity in elevation and terrain to support a much larger operation than either ranch could manage separately." He spread out a hand-drawn map that showed both properties in detail. Thomas had good instincts about land use, but he didn't have the capital to implement his plans. His irrigation system could work, but it needs completion and proper engineering. His barn can be repaired and expanded. "The house..." double quotes. Marcus paused, glancing at Samuel. "The house needs to be rebuilt completely. What would happen to it?" Samuel asked, and Rebecca heard the attachment in his voice. Despite its current condition, the Harper cabin represented his family's dreams and his father's hopes for their future. "We'd build a new house on the same site, designed for a family that size with proper winter insulation and modern conveniences. When you come of age, it would be yours along with your portion of the combined ranch." Marcus's tone was matter-of-fact, but Rebecca detected something gentler underneath. "This isn't about erasing your family's history, Samuel. It's about honoring your father's vision by making it successful." Rebecca felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, quickly followed by wariness. The offer was comprehensive, addressing problems she hadn't even fully identified yet. It was also almost too perfect, which made her suspicious of hidden costs or expectations that Marcus hadn't mentioned. "Mr. Whitman," she said carefully, "what exactly would you expect from this marriage? You've outlined business arrangements and practical considerations, but you haven't mentioned personal expectations." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Rebecca saw something that might have been vulnerability cross his features before he answered. "I expect mutual respect, Miss Walsh. Honest communication about problems before they become crises. Partnership in making decisions that affect the operation and the children. Beyond that... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I'm not looking for romantic love or passionate attachment. I'm looking for compatibility, shared goals, and the kind of friendship that develops between people who work well together." The honesty was both reassuring and slightly disappointing, though Rebecca couldn't quite identify why. Perhaps because Marcus Whitman's practical approach to marriage reminded her of her own reasons for answering Thomas Harper's advertisement: security and partnership rather than romance and passion. "What about the other children?" she asked. "Martha, the twins, Catherine, David, and Hope? What would their lives look like here? Better fed, properly clothed, educated, and with chores that teach useful skills rather than desperate survival." Marcus's answer was immediate. "Martha's old enough to help with household management and learn skills that will serve her well as an adult. The twins can learn ranch work and animal husbandry. Catherine and David need time to recover from their recent losses, but they have stability and support. Hope... His expression softened slightly. Hope would have the childhood she deserves. Rebecca found herself imagining the children in this house, Martha learning to manage a properly equipped kitchen, the twins working with horses and cattle under expert guidance, Catherine and David gradually healing from their trauma in an environment where they felt safe, Hope playing and learning without the constant shadow of hunger and insecurity. "There's something else," Marcus continued, opening a different ledger, "the financial arrangements. I want everything documented clearly so there's no confusion about assets, debts, or inheritance rights." He showed them pages of carefully written figures that outlined exactly how the combined ranch operation would work. The Harper family's debts would be paid from the Whitman Ranch's operating capital, but the payments would be recorded as loans against the Harper children's future inheritance. The combined property would operate as a single enterprise, but legal ownership would remain separate so that the children's rights were protected. When the children reach majority, Marcus explained, they'll inherit clear title to their father's land, plus their proportional share of improvements, made with combined resources. If our arrangement doesn't work out, the Harper property reverts to the children with no financial obligations beyond the original debts. Rebecca stared at the careful documentation, overwhelmed by the thoroughness of Marcus's planning. He'd thought through complications and contingencies that she hadn't even considered, providing legal protections for the children that went far beyond what she could have negotiated on her own. "This is very generous," she said finally. "Almost suspiciously generous. What do you gain from this arrangement that you couldn't achieve more easily on your own?" Marcus smiled for the first time since they'd begun discussing specifics, and Rebecca saw glimpses of warmth beneath his businesslike exterior. "Miss Walsh, I've been running this ranch alone for 3 years. I've hired housekeepers who couldn't manage the scale of operations, bookkeepers who couldn't understand the seasonal nature of ranch finances, and foremen who knew cattle but couldn't work with people. I need a true partner, someone with the intelligence and determination to share the responsibility." He gestured toward the ledgers and documents scattered across his desk. "I can make this ranch profitable, but I can't make it a home. I can manage business operations, but I can't provide the kind of family environment that makes hard work worthwhile. You and those children represent something I can't create on my own." Samuel had been listening to the entire conversation with the intense focus of someone whose future hung in the balance. Now he spoke up, his voice carrying the maturity that reminded Rebecca how much responsibility he'd been carrying. "Mr. Whitman, sir, if Miss Rebecca agrees to this arrangement, what would happen to me? I'm old enough to work, and I know the Harper land better than anyone. I don't want to be just another mouth to feed." Marcus turned his full attention to Samuel, and Rebecca saw him assessing the boy with new respect. "Samuel, you'd be my apprentice in ranch management. You'd learn animal husbandry, crop rotation, business planning, and everything else you'd need to eventually run your own operation. When you're ready, you'd take over management of the Harper portion of the combined ranch." The offer clearly meant everything to Samuel. Rebecca watched his careful composure crack slightly as he processed the possibility of having a future that honored his father's dreams while providing the security his siblings needed. "But what if ... quote Samuel started, then stopped, clearly struggling with how to voice his concerns. "What if the arrangement doesn't work?" Marcus finished gently. "What if Miss Rebecca and I discover we can't work together? Or what if circumstances change?" Samuel nodded, and Rebecca appreciated Marcus's willingness to address the boy's unspoken fears. "Then we'd handle it like adults, with proper legal documentation and fair division of assets," Marcus said firmly. "Your family's interests would be protected regardless of what happens between Miss Rebecca and me. That's why everything is being documented clearly, so there's no confusion about anyone's rights or obligations." Rebecca felt some of her wariness beginning to ease. Marcus Whitman was either the most honorable man she'd ever encountered, or he was skilled enough at deception to fool her completely. But watching his interactions with Samuel, seeing the careful respect he showed for a 14-year-old boy's legitimate concerns, she found herself inclined to trust his sincerity. "Mr. Whitman," she said slowly, "assuming I were to agree to this arrangement, what would be the timeline? The children can't stay in that damaged cabin much longer, and winter is coming. The marriage could take place within a week if you're willing. Legal documentation for the property arrangements would take longer, but the children could move here immediately after the ceremony." Marcus's practicality was reassuring, even as it made Rebecca's head spin with the speed of the proposed changes. "A week?" Rebecca's voice came out higher than she'd intended. "That's very fast for such a significant decision." "It is," Marcus agreed. "But circumstances don't allow for extended courtship. Miss Walsh, those children need stability now, not after months of careful consideration. Sometimes practical decisions have to be made quickly." Rebecca looked at Samuel, seeing hope and apprehension warring in his expression. She thought about the 6 other children waiting for her at the Harper cabin, about the approaching winter, about the impossible odds they faced alone versus the comprehensive solution Marcus Whitman was offering. "I need to discuss this with the children," she said finally. "This decision affects all of us, and they deserve to understand what they'd be agreeing to." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Of course. Take whatever time you need. But Miss Walsh—" He paused, his expression growing serious. "I want you to understand that this offer is genuine. I'm not in the habit of making promises I can't keep, and I don't propose arrangements I'm not prepared to honor completely." As they prepared to leave the Whitman ranch, Rebecca felt as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, unable to see the bottom, but knowing that jumping was probably safer than staying where she was. Marcus Whitman represented everything she'd hoped to find when she'd come west: security, partnership, and a chance to build something meaningful. But he also represented the unknown, and Rebecca had learned to be wary of men who made promises that seemed too good to be true. The question now was whether her desperation was making her see salvation where none existed, or whether she'd genuinely found the solution to problems that had seemed insurmountable just hours before the ride back to the Harper Ranch gave her time to think, but not enough time to reach any definitive conclusions. Samuel was uncharacteristically quiet, clearly processing everything he'd heard, and trying to decide whether he dared to hope that his family's nightmare might finally be ending. "Miss Rebecca," he said as they approached the damaged cabin where his siblings waited, "do you think he means it? Do you think this could really work?" Rebecca looked at the boy who'd been forced to become a man too soon, thought about the responsibilities she was considering accepting, and gave him the only honest answer she could. "I think Marcus Whitman is either going to save all of us, Samuel, or I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my life. The question is whether we can afford not to find out which one it is." The family meeting that evening took place around a campfire outside the damaged Harper cabin, with 7 children arranged in a semicircle facing Rebecca, while she tried to find words that would help them understand the magnitude of the decision they all faced together. The firelight flickered across their faces, highlighting the hope and wariness that had become their default expressions whenever adults discussed their future. "Before I tell you about Mr. Whitman's proposal," Rebecca began carefully, "I want you all to understand that this is a family decision. It affects each of you differently, and everyone deserves to have their concerns heard and considered." Martha, ever the surrogate mother, spoke first. "Is he a good man, Miss Rebecca? Does he seem like someone who would keep his promises?" The question went straight to the heart of Rebecca's own uncertainty. "He seems honorable, Martha. He's thought through details that most people wouldn't consider, and he's offered legal protections for all of you that go beyond what anyone would require. But I've only known him for 1 day, so I can't guarantee anything about his character." 10-year-old Joseph, one of the twins, raised his hand with the formal politeness children used when discussing serious matters. "Would we all stay together? Nobody gets sent away or split up?" "According to Mr. Whitman's plan, yes. You'd all live in his house, which is large enough for everyone, and you'd remain together as a family." Rebecca saw relief flicker across several faces, but she pressed on. "However, you should understand that this would mean significant changes in how you live day to day." She outlined Marcus's expectations about chores, education, and behavior, watching the children's reactions carefully. Samuel had already heard most of this information, but he listened intently to how his siblings responded to each detail. Catherine, who had barely spoken since Rebecca's arrival, surprised everyone by asking, "Would we have enough food every day?" The quiet desperation in the 8-year-old's voice broke Rebecca's heart. These children had lived with hunger for so long that adequate nutrition seemed like an impossible luxury rather than a basic right. "Yes, Catherine. Mr. Whitman's ranch produces most of its own food, and he has resources to purchase whatever else is needed. You would never have to worry about having enough to eat. Little Hope, who had been playing with her tattered doll throughout the conversation, looked up with the serious expression that seemed too old for her 4-year-old face. Would the new daddy be mean to us? Rebecca knelt beside Hope, meeting her eyes directly. I don't think so, sweetheart. Mr. Whitman spoke about you children with respect and kindness. But he would expect you to follow rules and do age-appropriate chores, just like any family. David, who rarely spoke at all, surprised everyone by asking, "What if we don't like it there? What if we want to come back here?" The question revealed fears that Rebecca had been trying not to acknowledge. These children had lost their parents and their security. Of course, they would be terrified of losing control over their lives completely. "That's an excellent question, David," she said, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Mr. Whitman has put legal protections in place to ensure that this land remains yours regardless of what happens with our arrangement. If the situation doesn't work out, you would still inherit your father's ranch when you're adults." Samuel had been listening to his siblings' concerns with the protective intensity that had become his defining characteristic since their father's death. Now he spoke with the authority of someone who'd seen more of Marcus Whitman's operation than the others. "I think we should try it," he said quietly. "Mr. Whitman knows things about ranching that Papa never learned. He's offered to teach me everything I need to know to make this place profitable again, and ... He paused, looking around at his siblings' thin faces and worn clothes. "We can't survive the winter here. We just can't." Martha nodded slowly, clearly wrestling with the decision. What would happen to Mama and Papa's things? The furniture that didn't burn, Papa's tools, Mama's china? Everything would be moved to the Whitman house or stored safely until the new house is built on this land. Rebecca assured her, "Mr. Whitman was very clear that your family's belongings and memories would be preserved and respected." Joshua, the other twin, had been unusually quiet throughout the discussion. Now he spoke up with a practical concern that showed how quickly frontier children learn to think about survival. "Miss Rebecca, what if you and Mr. Whitman don't get along? What if you decide you don't want to be married anymore? What happens to us then?" The question highlighted one of Rebecca's deepest fears about the arrangement. She was gambling not just her own future, but the futures of 7 children who had already suffered too much disappointment and loss. "Mr. Whitman has promised that your rights to this land and your place in his household would be protected regardless of what happens between him and me," she said carefully. "He's put those promises in writing with legal documentation. But you're right to be concerned. This arrangement involves risks for all of us." The children were quiet for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about a future that offered both tremendous promise and significant uncertainty. Rebecca waited, knowing that pushing them toward a decision would be unfair and counterproductive. Finally, Martha spoke for the group with the gravity of someone accepting adult responsibility. "Miss Rebecca, we trust you. If you think Mr. Whitman is honorable and this arrangement could work, then we're willing to try it. We don't really have other options, and we want to stay together more than anything else." The other children nodded in agreement, though Rebecca could see varying degrees of apprehension in their expressions. They were choosing to trust her judgment because they had no alternative, which made the weight of responsibility almost overwhelming. "Then I'll send word to Mr. Whitman that we accept his proposal," Rebecca said, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "The wedding would take place next week, and you would all move to his ranch immediately afterward." That night, after the children had settled into their makeshift sleeping arrangements, Rebecca lay awake, staring at the stars and trying to process the magnitude of what she'd agreed to do. In less than a week, she would marry a man she barely knew, become stepmother to 7 traumatized children, and take on responsibilities that would have challenged someone with years of experience. The next morning brought the practical realities. of preparing for a wedding and a household merger under impossible circumstances. Rebecca's first stop was the general store, where she needed to purchase fabric for a wedding dress and arrange for supplies to be delivered to the Whitman Ranch. William Patterson, the storekeeper, greeted her with the careful curiosity of someone who'd heard rumors but wanted to verify details before offering opinions. "Miss Walsh, I understand congratulations are in order. Marcus Whitman is a good man. You could do far worse in this territory." "Thank you, Mr. Patterson. I'm hoping you might help me with some immediate needs." Rebecca handed him a list she'd compiled the night before. "I need fabric for a wedding dress, traveling clothes for 7 children, and basic toiletries, and personal items." Patterson studied the list with raised eyebrows. "This is quite a shopping expedition. Are you certain about the quantities?" Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "The children have very little, Mr. Patterson. They need proper clothing for their new circumstances. Of course. Patterson's tone became more supportive as he understood the scope of the situation. Marcus mentioned he'd be covering expenses for the Harper children. Good man, taking on that kind of responsibility. As Patterson gathered items from her list, Rebecca found herself fielding questions from other customers who had heard fragments of the story and wanted to understand the full situation. The attention was uncomfortable, but not entirely negative. Most people seemed genuinely pleased that the Harper children would have proper care, and several women offered advice about frontier wedding preparations. Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, the banker's wife, approached with the kind of determined helpfulness that could either be a blessing or a burden. "My dear Miss Walsh, a week is hardly enough time to prepare for a proper wedding. You simply must allow the ladies of the community to assist with arrangements." Rebecca appreciated the offer, even as she worried about accepting charity that might come with strings attached. "That's very kind, Mrs. Carter, but I don't want to impose on anyone." "Nonsense. A wedding is a community celebration, especially when it involves such heartwarming circumstances. We'll organize a reception, arrange flowers, and ensure you have everything needed for a memorable ceremony." By afternoon, Rebecca found herself swept into a whirlwind of wedding preparations, orchestrated by women who had decided that her marriage to Marcus Whitman deserved proper community support. The local dressmaker, Mrs. Agnes Thompson, insisted on creating a wedding dress from fabric donated by various community members. "Every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day," Mrs. Thompson declared while taking Rebecca's measurements. "And Mr. Whitman deserves a wife who looks the part of a successful rancher's spouse." The dress fittings provided opportunities for Rebecca to learn more about Marcus Whitman from women who had known him for years. The picture that emerged was of a man who was respected for his business acumen, appreciated for his fair dealing with employees and neighbors, and somewhat pitied for his solitary existence since his first wife's death. Marcus loved Sarah deeply, Mrs. Thompson confided while adjusting the dress's neckline. "Her death nearly broke him. He's been alone too long, but he's also been careful not to make promises he couldn't keep. This arrangement with you, it's practical, which is probably what he needs." Rebecca found herself curious about Marcus's first wife, though she was careful not to ask questions that might seem intrusive. What kind of woman had Sarah Whitman been? What kind of marriage had she and Marcus shared? And how did Rebecca's practical arrangement compare to what had come before? Meanwhile, the Harper children were experiencing their own adjustments to their changing circumstances. Samuel spent his days helping Marcus with ranch work, learning techniques and systems that would have taken his father years to develop independently. The younger children visited the Whitman Ranch daily, gradually becoming familiar with their future home and the rhythms of a functioning household. Martha proved particularly helpful in understanding the scale of domestic operations she and Rebecca would be managing. The Whitman kitchen was equipped for feeding large groups during busy seasons, with preserved foods, cooking equipment, and storage systems that dwarfed anything the Harper family had possessed. "Miss Rebecca," Martha said during one of these orientation visits, "Mr. Whitman's kitchen is bigger than our whole cabin was. How will we learn to manage everything?" "The same way people learn any new skill," Rebecca replied, trying to project confidence while she studied the massive wood-burning stove that would be her primary tool. One step at a time, with patience and practice. Marcus proved to be a surprisingly considerate teacher, taking time to explain not just what needed to be done, but why certain systems had evolved and how they could be adapted to accommodate the expanded household. He showed Rebecca his record-keeping methods, introduced her to suppliers and tradespeople, and outlined seasonal rhythms that would affect everything from meal planning to purchasing decisions. "The key to successful ranch management," he explained while showing her through the root cellar where winter vegetables were stored, "is thinking ahead and preparing for problems before they become crises. Everything we do in summer and fall determines whether we thrive or merely survive during winter." Rebecca appreciated both his knowledge and his willingness to share it without condescension. Marcus treated her as an intelligent partner who needed information rather than a helpless woman who required constant supervision. The respect was refreshing after years of being dismissed or patronized by men who assumed her gender made her inherently incompetent. The children's integration into the Whitman household proceeded more smoothly than Rebecca had dared to hope. Hope attached herself to Marcus with the trusting affection of a small child who instinctively recognized kindness, while the older children approached him with careful politeness that gradually warmed into genuine rapport. Catherine, who had been so withdrawn and fearful, began to show glimmers of her personality when Marcus asked her opinion about which horses were gentlest for beginning riders. David started speaking more frequently during meals, usually to ask questions about ranch operations that demonstrated his quick intelligence. The twins threw themselves into learning ranch work with enthusiasm that reminded Rebecca how much boys their age needed physical challenges and meaningful responsibilities. Joshua proved particularly gifted with horses, while Joseph showed aptitude for the mechanical aspects of ranch equipment. By the end of the week, Rebecca felt cautiously optimistic about the practical aspects of their arrangement. The children were adapting well. Marcus had proven to be patient and fair in his interactions with them, and she was beginning to understand the scope and rhythms of her new responsibilities. But underneath her growing confidence lay persistent questions about the personal dimensions of her marriage to Marcus Whitman. They had established a working partnership and mutual respect, but they remained essentially strangers who had agreed to share a household and a future, based on practical considerations rather than emotional connection. The night before her wedding, Rebecca sat in her room at the boarding house where she'd been staying during the transition period, trying to prepare mentally for the most significant decision of her life. Tomorrow she would marry a man she respected but didn't love, become mother to 7 children who needed her protection, and begin a new life that offered security at the cost of romantic dreams she'd barely acknowledged possessing. But as she thought about the alternatives, the children separated and sent to orphanages. The Harper Ranch lost to debt. Her own return to Boston with nothing to show for her Western adventure. Rebecca knew she was making the right choice. Sometimes the best decisions were the practical ones, and sometimes security was more valuable than passion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities. But tonight, for the first time since arriving in Clearwater Valley, Rebecca Walsh felt genuinely hopeful about the future. The wedding ceremony took place on a crisp October morning in the Clearwater Valley Methodist Church, with most of the community in attendance despite the short notice. Rebecca stood at the altar wearing the ivory silk dress that Mrs. Thompson and her volunteers had completed just hours before, feeling simultaneously grateful for the community's support and overwhelmed by the magnitude of the commitment she was making. Marcus appeared at her side in a dark suit that emphasized his tall frame and steady presence. But what struck Rebecca most was the gentle way he helped little Hope arranged her flower petals, and the encouraging nod he gave Samuel, who stood with his siblings in the front pew. Whatever uncertainties Rebecca harbored about their personal relationship, she felt increasingly confident that Marcus Whitman would honor his commitments to the children. The ceremony itself was brief and practical, reflecting the nature of their arrangement. When the minister asked if she would love, honor, and cherish Marcus Whitman, Rebecca answered, "I will," with conviction, meaning it in terms of respect and partnership, even if romantic love remained an unknown quantity. Marcus's vows carried the same weight of sincere commitment without flowery declarations that neither of them could guarantee. The reception that followed showcased the community's genuine enthusiasm for the match. Tables laden with food appeared in the church hall, contributed by families who understood the practical importance of the union for the Harper children's welfare. Rebecca found herself accepting congratulations from people who viewed her marriage as a solution that benefited everyone involved. "You've done a fine thing, taking on those children," Mrs. Carter told her during the reception. "And Marcus needed someone with your backbone to help him build something lasting. This community has been waiting for both of you to find what you needed." The transition to married life began immediately after the reception, when Rebecca and the children moved their belongings to the Whitman Ranch. The house that would now be their home felt enormous after the cramped quarters they'd been sharing, and Rebecca watched the children explore their new rooms with wonder and cautious excitement. Marcus had prepared carefully for their arrival. Each child had their own bed with warm quilts, adequate storage for clothing, and small personal touches that showed he'd been listening to their individual interests. Hope's room included a shelf for her doll collection that he'd started with a beautiful new doll from Denver. The twins' shared room featured maps and books about ranching that would support their education and growing interest in the operation. "This is really ours?" Catherine asked softly, running her hand over the quilt on her bed. "We can stay here as long as we want?" "This is your home now," Rebecca assured her, though she felt the weight of making promises about a future that depended on variables beyond her control. "Mr. Whitman, your new stepfather, wants you to feel secure and comfortable here." The first few weeks of married life established routines that surprised Rebecca with their naturalness. Marcus proved to be an early riser who handled morning chores before breakfast, allowing Rebecca time to organize household operations and help the children adjust to their new responsibilities. Meals became family gatherings, where ranch business was discussed alongside the children's activities and concerns. Rebecca discovered that managing the Whitman household required skills she'd developed during years of careful budgeting and resource management, but on a scale that made her previous experience seem like practice exercises. Planning meals for 10 people during regular seasons and up to 15 during busy periods demanded strategic thinking about food preservation, bulk purchasing, and seasonal availability. Her first major test came when Marcus announced that the fall roundup would begin the following week, requiring additional hired hands who would need boarding and meals for nearly a month. Rebecca had never cooked for a crew of working men, and the prospect of feeding hungry cowboys 3 substantial meals a day while managing regular household operations felt overwhelming. "The secret," Marcus explained while showing her through the ranch's supply storage, "is preparation and organization." Sarah used to start planning for roundup weeks in advance, making sure we had adequate supplies and equipment ready before the work began. The mention of his first wife was casual but significant, the first time Marcus had referenced Sarah directly in Rebecca's presence. Rebecca found herself curious about the woman who had managed these operations before her, wondering what Sarah Whitman had been like and how Rebecca's own methods would compare. Marcus seemed to sense her uncertainty. Sarah grew up on a ranch, so she understood the rhythms from childhood. "You're starting with different knowledge, but you're also bringing organizational skills that she never developed. Don't try to do everything exactly as she did. Find methods that work for your strengths." The encouragement was practical rather than romantic, but Rebecca appreciated both his honesty about the challenges and his confidence in her abilities. Marcus wasn't expecting her to become a replica of his first wife. He was trusting her to develop her own approach to the responsibilities they shared. Rebecca threw herself into Roundup preparations with the systematic thoroughness she'd learned during years of managing limited resources. She created detailed meal plans, inventory lists, and work schedules that would allow her to feed the crew adequately while maintaining regular household operations for the children. Martha proved invaluable as an assistant, quickly learning to manage multiple cooking tasks simultaneously and helping organize the massive quantities of food required for hungry workers. Samuel contributed by handling supply runs to town and coordinating with Marcus about crew schedules and requirements. The day before Roundup began, Rebecca stood in the kitchen surveying her preparations, rows of preserved vegetables, sacks of flour and beans, sides of bacon hanging in the smokehouse, and detailed plans for every meal over the next 4 weeks. The scale of the operation would have been impossible for one person to manage alone. But with Martha's help and the older children's contributions, she felt cautiously optimistic about meeting the challenge. Nervous? Marcus asked, appearing in the kitchen after completing his own final preparations. Terrified, Rebecca admitted, but also excited. This feels like the kind of work that actually matters, that contributes to something larger than just getting through another day. Marcus studied her with an expression that seemed to hold approval, mixed with something warmer. You've organized this better than most experienced ranch wives would have managed. The crew is going to eat well, and that makes every other aspect of the work easier. The compliment meant more to Rebecca than she'd expected. Marcus Whitman was not someone who offered empty praise, so his acknowledgement of her efforts carried genuine weight. She was contributing meaningfully to the ranch's success, proving that her partnership brought real value beyond simply providing care for the children. Roundup season proved to be a revelation for the entire family. Rebecca discovered that she thrived under the pressure of managing complex operations with multiple moving parts. The systematic approach she developed for household management scaled effectively to meet the demands of feeding and housing a crew of 15 men while maintaining regular family routines. The children found their own roles in the expanded household operations. Martha became Rebecca's chief assistant in the kitchen, learning skills that would serve her well as an adult while contributing essential help during the busiest periods. Samuel worked directly with the crew, learning advanced ranching techniques, while proving himself capable of handling significant responsibilities. Even the younger children contributed according to their abilities. Catherine helped with food preservation and organization, slowly gaining confidence as she mastered new skills. David emerged from his shell when given responsibility for maintaining supply inventories, discovering that he had a natural aptitude for detailed record keeping. The twins threw themselves into every aspect of ranch work, competing good-naturedly to master rope work, cattle handling, and horse care. Hope, at 4 years old, became the crew's unofficial mascot, charming the cowboys with her fearless curiosity about ranch operations and her innocent questions about everything from cattle behavior to equipment maintenance. Her presence reminded everyone that the ranch was more than a business operation. It was a home where children could grow up surrounded by meaningful work and adult attention. That little one's got the makings of a real rancher, Charlie Morrison, the crew foreman, told Rebecca during one of the evening meals. Asks better questions than most grown men, and she's not afraid of anything with 4 legs. Rebecca felt a surge of pride that surprised her with its intensity. These children were thriving in ways that would have been impossible under their previous circumstances, developing skills and confidence that would serve them throughout their lives. The marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement was proving to create genuine benefits for everyone involved. The success of Roundup season marked a turning point in Rebecca's relationship with Marcus. Their partnership had evolved from careful politeness to genuine collaboration, based on mutual respect for each other's capabilities and shared commitment to the ranch's success. They developed an easy working rhythm that required minimal discussion, Marcus handling outdoor operations, while Rebecca managed household and business administration, but with significant overlap in consultation on major decisions. One evening, after the crew had departed and the ranch had settled back into its regular routines, Marcus found Rebecca in the study where she was updating financial records from the roundup sales. "The numbers look good," he said, reviewing her careful calculations. "Better than I'd projected, actually. Your meal planning kept costs lower than usual, and the crew worked more efficiently because they were well fed and comfortable." Rebecca felt a flush of satisfaction at his acknowledgement of her contribution to the ranch's profitability. "I enjoyed the challenge, managing complex operations with multiple variables. It's the kind of work I never knew I was capable of doing." Marcus settled into the chair across from her desk, and Rebecca noticed that his usual formal posture had relaxed into something more companionable. "You've exceeded every expectation I had when I made my original proposal. The children are thriving. The household operations run more smoothly than they have since Sarah's death, and you've brought organizational skills that have improved every aspect of the ranch." The comparison to Sarah was significant, and Rebecca found herself asking the question she'd been avoiding for weeks. "Do you miss her, your first wife?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Rebecca worried she'd overstepped boundaries that he wasn't ready to discuss. When he finally answered, his voice carried both sadness and acceptance. "I miss the partnership we had, the shared history and understanding that develops over years of working together. But I've learned that different kinds of partnerships can be equally valuable." He met Rebecca's eyes directly. "What we're building is different from what Sarah and I shared, but it's not lesser. It's based on different strengths and different circumstances." The honesty was both reassuring and slightly melancholy. Rebecca appreciated Marcus's directness about his feelings, even as she wondered whether their practical partnership could eventually develop into something deeper. But perhaps that was the wrong question. Perhaps what they had already built was sufficient for a successful marriage and a happy life. "I'm grateful for this opportunity," she said carefully. "For the chance to prove that I can contribute meaningfully to something important, and for the family we're creating together." Marcus smiled, and Rebecca saw genuine warmth in his expression. "Rebecca, you haven't just contributed, you've transformed this place. The children have gone from survival to thriving. The ranch operates more efficiently than it ever has, and—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "And I've remembered what it feels like to have a true partner rather than just hired help." As Rebecca prepared for bed that night in the room she still inhabited alone despite being married for over a month, she reflected on the unexpected satisfaction she'd found in her new life. The work was demanding and the responsibilities were significant, but she was using skills she'd never known she possessed to build something lasting and meaningful. The children were not just surviving but flourishing, developing into capable young people with bright futures ahead of them. Samuel was becoming an accomplished rancher under Marcus's guidance. Martha was learning household management skills that would serve her well as an adult, and even the youngest children were gaining confidence and competence that would benefit them throughout their lives. Rebecca herself had discovered capabilities and strengths she'd never had the opportunity to develop during her previous life. She was managing complex operations, making decisions that affected multiple families' livelihoods, and earning respect from her community for her contributions rather than her compliance. If this wasn't the romantic love she'd once imagined marriage would bring, it was something equally valuable: a partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine care for each other's welfare. Perhaps, Rebecca thought as she drifted towards sleep, that was enough. Perhaps it was even better than enough. Winter descended on Clearwater Valley with unusual ferocity, bringing temperatures that froze water pipes and snow that drifted against the ranch buildings in sculptured waves that sometimes reached second-story windows. Rebecca had thought she understood Montana winters from Marcus's descriptions, but the reality of managing the household operation, while nature seemed determined to isolate them from the outside world, proved more challenging than any preparation could have anticipated. The crisis began on a February morning when Rebecca woke to discover that the main water line to the house had frozen solid during the night. What should have been a manageable inconvenience became a serious problem when Marcus and Samuel's attempts to thaw the pipes revealed that a section had cracked, flooding the root cellar where most of their winter food supplies were stored. "How bad is it?" Rebecca asked, surveying the damage by lamplight while the children gathered behind her with worried expressions. Marcus's face was grim as he examined the soaked storage areas. "Bad enough. We've lost most of the preserved vegetables, probably. Half the flour and grain stores, and the salt pork is contaminated. With the roads snowed in, we can't get replacement supplies until the spring thaw." The magnitude of the disaster settled over Rebecca like a physical weight. They had 15 people to feed for at least 6 more weeks, possibly longer if spring came late, and their primary food reserves had been destroyed. The general store in town might have some supplies, but reaching it would require dangerous travel through snow that had already claimed 2 lives in the county this winter. "What are our remaining resources?" Rebecca asked, forcing herself to think systematically despite the panic trying to take hold. Samuel, who had become increasingly capable at inventory management, produced his carefully maintained records. "We've got enough flour for maybe 3 weeks if we ration carefully. The meat in the smokehouse is still good, but there's not enough to carry us through. The canned goods from last summer are mostly gone, and the potatoes and root vegetables are ruined." Rebecca studied the numbers while her mind raced through possibilities. They needed to stretch inadequate supplies across an unknowable period while maintaining enough nutrition to keep everyone healthy during the harshest part of winter. It was the kind of problem that demanded creative solutions and careful resource management. "Marcus," she said finally, "what about hunting? And are there any other food sources we haven't considered?" "Hunting's possible, but dangerous in weather like this. Game is scarce during winter storms, and anyone who gets lost in conditions like these." He didn't need to finish the sentence. There might be emergency supplies cached at some of the line shacks on the outer ranges, but reaching them would be risky. Rebecca nodded, already formulating plans that would require everyone in the household to contribute beyond their usual responsibilities. "Then we'll have to make what we have stretch further while finding additional sources. Martha, I need you to help me inventory every scrap of food in this house. Samuel, work with Marcus to map out the safest routes to any emergency caches. Everyone else, we're going to start rationing immediately." The next few days tested every organizational skill Rebecca had developed, and several she had to invent on the spot. She created meal plans that squeezed maximum nutrition from minimum resources, transforming small amounts of meat into hearty stews by adding wild plants that Martha had learned to identify from a book in Marcus's library. The children responded to the crisis with the resilience that frontier life had taught them, accepting reduced portions without complaint and contributing creative solutions to their food shortage. Catherine remembered seeing rosehips during their autumn walks and suggested they might be harvested from beneath the snow for vitamin content. David proposed using fish lines through holes cut in the frozen creek, despite the difficulty of maintaining ice fishing in sub-zero temperatures. Martha proved invaluable during the crisis, demonstrating cooking skills that transformed unpromising ingredients into palatable meals while helping Rebecca maintain everyone's morale through cheerful determination. "We're like pioneers," she told the younger children during one particularly sparse dinner, "learning to make do with whatever we can find, just like the explorers in our history books." Marcus spent his days attempting dangerous supply runs to the outer range buildings, often returning empty-handed after hours of travel through snow that could easily have claimed his life. The physical demands of traveling in such conditions, combined with inadequate nutrition, began to take their toll on everyone in the household. It was during the third week of rationing that Rebecca made a discovery that changed everything. While searching through storage areas she hadn't previously explored, she found a locked room in the basement that Marcus had never mentioned. When she asked him about it, his expression grew uncomfortable. "That was Sarah's preserve room," he said. Quietly, "I sealed it after she died because I couldn't bear to use the things she'd put away for our future." Rebecca felt a surge of hope mixed with careful sensitivity to Marcus's emotional attachment to his first wife's preparations. "Marcus, if there are preserved foods in there, we need them." Sarah would have wanted her provisions to save lives, not sit unused while children go hungry. Marcus was silent for a long moment before producing a key from his desk drawer. "You're right. Sarah always said emergency supplies were for emergencies, not for keeping as monuments to the past." The preserve room contained treasures that made Rebecca's eyes fill with tears of relief. Rows of canned vegetables, preserved meats, dried fruits, and specialty items that Sarah Whitman had carefully prepared during her years of managing the ranch. There were enough supplies to carry them through the remainder of winter with adequate nutrition, provided they continued rationing sensibly. But the discovery also revealed the depth of Marcus's grief over his first wife's death. As Rebecca cataloged Sarah's carefully labeled preserves, she found notes in the margins of recipes, planning notes for future meals, and evidence of a woman who had loved her family enough to prepare obsessively for their security. "She was quite a manager," Rebecca said softly as she and Marcus surveyed the preserved foods. "These supplies are organized better than anything I've seen." Marcus nodded, running his fingers along shelves that Sarah had built and stocked. "She had 2 miscarriages before she died, and each loss made her more determined to create security for whatever family we might eventually have. She spent her last months preserving food like she was trying to protect children who never existed." The revelation gave Rebecca new insight into Marcus's practical approach to their marriage. He had loved Sarah deeply and lost not just his wife, but the family they had planned to build together. His decision to marry Rebecca had been about creating the family life that Sarah's death had denied him, using the foundation she had established. "I'm not trying to replace her," Rebecca said carefully, "but I want to honor what she built by using it to protect the family we have now." Marcus met her eyes with an expression that seemed to hold gratitude and something deeper. "Sarah would have loved those children, Rebecca. She would have been proud to know her preparations helped save them." The food crisis marked a turning point in Rebecca's relationship with the entire household. She had proven herself capable of managing resources under extreme pressure, making difficult decisions that required balancing immediate needs against long-term survival and maintaining family morale during genuinely frightening circumstances. More importantly, she had successfully integrated Sarah's legacy into their current family structure without jealousy or competition. By honoring the first Mrs. Whitman's contributions while taking responsibility for current needs, Rebecca had demonstrated a maturity that impressed Marcus and helped the children understand that families could honor the past while building new futures. The crisis also revealed the children's individual strengths under pressure. Samuel proved himself capable of adult-level responsibility, making dangerous supply runs with Marcus and contributing strategic thinking to their survival plans. Martha's cooking skills and cheerful leadership helped maintain everyone's spirits during the darkest days of rationing. Even the younger children contributed according to their abilities, accepting hardship without complaint and offering creative solutions to difficult problems. But the greatest test came during the final week of February, when little hope developed. A fever that spiked dangerously high despite Rebecca's nursing efforts. With roads still impassable and the nearest doctor 20 miles away, Rebecca found herself responsible for medical decisions that could determine whether the 4-year-old lived or died. I don't know enough about treating serious illness, Rebecca confessed to Marcus after Hope's fever had climbed to levels that terrified her. In Boston, we had doctors and hospitals. Here, if I make the wrong choice. Marcus placed steady, hands on her shoulders, his brown eyes holding complete confidence in her abilities. Rebecca, you've kept this family alive and healthy for months, under conditions that would have defeated most people. Trust your instincts and your intelligence. You know more than you think you do. Rebecca drew on every bit of medical knowledge she'd gained during years of caring for her invalid mother, combining it with advice from Martha, who had helped nurse siblings through various childhood illnesses. They created a treatment plan that involved careful temperature monitoring, herbal remedies that Catherine had learned to identify, and round-the-clock nursing that required everyone in the household to contribute. The vigil over, Hope's illness lasted 4 days and nights, with Rebecca maintaining constant bedside attention while Marcus and the older children managed all other household operations. The crisis brought the family together in ways that ordinary circumstances couldn't have achieved, with everyone contributing to Hope's care according to their abilities. Martha prepared special foods that might tempt a sick child's appetite. Samuel and the twins took turns reading stories to Hope when she was awake enough to listen. Catherine and David helped with the constant tasks of temperature monitoring and medication schedules. Even Marcus, despite his outdoor responsibilities, spent hours holding Hope when she was restless, singing songs he remembered from his own childhood. On the 4th night, Hope's fever finally broke, leaving her weak but clearly recovering. Rebecca, who had barely slept during the crisis, finally allowed herself to rest while Martha took over the patient's care with competence that would have impressed trained nurses. "You saved her life," Marcus said quietly as they watched Hope sleep peacefully for the first time in days. "Your determination and knowledge made the difference between recovery and tragedy." Rebecca felt exhausted triumph mixed with profound relief. She had faced the ultimate test of frontier motherhood, nursing a desperately ill child back to health, using only her own resources and judgment, and succeeded. The confidence that came from surviving such a crisis would serve her well in whatever future challenges they might face. The winter that had seemed determined to defeat them finally began to loosen its grip during the first week of March. Snow started melting from the southern slopes, revealing patches of brown earth that promised spring's eventual arrival. Roads remained difficult but became passable for emergency travel, ending their complete isolation from the outside world. When Dr. Patterson finally made it through to examine Hope, he pronounced her recovery complete and praised Rebecca's nursing techniques. "Textbook treatment," he said approvingly. "You handled everything exactly as I would have recommended. That child is lucky to have someone with your skills caring for her." The validation from a medical professional meant more to Rebecca than she'd expected. She had proven herself capable, not just of managing household operations and surviving resource shortages, but of making life-and-death medical decisions under pressure. The confidence that came from such success would influence every aspect of her future role as the family's protector and decision-maker. As spring gradually reclaimed the Montana landscape, Rebecca reflected on the winter that had tested every aspect of their new family structure. They had faced food shortages, dangerous weather, serious illness, and complete isolation from outside help, but they had survived through cooperation, careful resource management, and mutual support that went far beyond mere obligation. The children had proven themselves capable of adult-level responsibility when circumstances demanded it, while also maintaining the playfulness and curiosity that healthy childhood required. Marcus had demonstrated trust in Rebecca's judgment that went far beyond their original business arrangement, relying on her skills and instincts during genuinely life-threatening situations. Most importantly, Rebecca had discovered reserves of strength and competence that she'd never known she possessed. She could manage complex operations under extreme pressure, make difficult decisions that affected multiple lives, and maintain family cohesion during circumstances that might have broken less determined people. The winter had tested every aspect of their practical partnership and revealed it to be stronger than either Rebecca or Marcus had dared to hope when they'd first agreed to their marriage arrangement. They had built something that could survive the worst challenges frontier life could offer, based on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and genuine care for each other's welfare. As Rebecca planned for spring planting and thought about the challenges that lay ahead, she felt genuinely optimistic about their family's future. They had proven themselves capable of surviving whatever difficulties life might present, and that knowledge would inform every decision they made going forward. Spring's arrival in Clearwater Valley brought more than just wildflowers and warming temperatures. It brought visitors that would test everything Rebecca had built during her first year as Mrs. Marcus Whitman. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early April, delivered by a writer who had traveled from Helena with documents that carried the official seal of the territorial government. Marcus read the letter twice before handing it to Rebecca, his expression grim. "We have a problem." The letter was signed by Harold Thornton, identified as a territorial administrator for the Department of Child Welfare, and its contents made Rebecca's blood run cold. Someone had filed a formal complaint alleging that the Harper children were being kept in unsuitable conditions by an unfit guardian who had obtained custody through fraudulent means. According to this, Rebecca said, reading through the legal language that obscured but couldn't hide the serious nature of the accusations, "I'm being investigated for child endangerment, fraudulent marriage, and improper assumption of guardianship responsibilities. They're sending an inspector to evaluate our household and determine whether the children should be removed to proper institutional care." Samuel, who had been helping with morning chores, entered the kitchen in time to hear the last part of Rebecca's statement. His face went white with fear that was immediately replaced by angry determination. "They can't take us away," he said fiercely. "We're family now. We belong here." Marcus set the letter on the table with careful precision, his movements controlled, in the way that Rebecca had learned indicated deep anger being held in check. "The inspector is due to arrive next week. We need to understand who filed this complaint and why, and we need to prepare for questions that could determine this family's future." Rebecca's mind raced through possibilities, but one name kept surfacing as the most likely source of their troubles. Thomas Harper's brother, the one who never responded to letters about the children after Thomas died. She remembered Sheriff Mitchell mentioning an uncle in Helena who had been contacted after Thomas Harper's death, but had shown no interest in taking responsibility for 7 orphaned children. Now apparently that same uncle had decided to interfere, with arrangements that were working successfully for everyone involved. "Edmund Harper," Marcus confirmed. "I've made some inquiries since receiving this letter. He's been spreading stories about our marriage being a scheme to steal his brother's property, claiming that you're an unfit guardian who married me solely to gain access to ranch assets." The accusations were infuriating in their distortion of truth, but Rebecca could see how they might seem plausible to someone who didn't understand the actual circumstances. A mail-order bride arriving to find her intended husband dead, then immediately marrying the wealthiest rancher in the county, could appear suspiciously convenient to outsiders who chose to view the situation cynically. "What exactly will this inspector be looking for?" Rebecca asked, forcing herself to think strategically rather than emotionally about the threat they faced. Marcus consulted a second letter that had arrived with the first. Evidence of proper housing, adequate nutrition, appropriate education, moral guidance, and emotional stability for the children. They'll also investigate the legitimacy of our marriage and the legal arrangements regarding the Harper property. Rebecca felt a surge of confidence that surprised her. After the winter they'd survived, after the challenges they'd overcome, and the family bonds they'd built, she wasn't afraid of any objective evaluation of their household. The children were thriving in ways that would be obvious to any fair observer. "Then we have nothing to worry about," she said firmly. "These children are better cared for than most children in the territory. They're well fed, properly educated, learning valuable skills, and clearly happy. Any honest inspector will see that immediately." But Marcus's expression remained troubled. "Rebecca, territorial inspectors aren't always honest. If Edmund Harper has connections in Helena, or if he's made financial arrangements with the inspector, objective evaluation might not be what we get. The possibility that corruption might endanger the children's welfare ignited a protective fury in Rebecca that she'd never experienced before. These children had suffered enough loss and displacement. She would not allow some distant uncle, who had ignored them during their greatest need, to destroy the security they'd finally found. "Then we make sure the inspector's report reflects the truth so clearly that no one can dispute it," she said with a determination that made Samuel straighten with hope. "We document everything, prepare witnesses, and demonstrate that these children are receiving better care here than they would in any institutional setting." The week of preparation that followed revealed the depth of community support that Rebecca and Marcus had built through their first year of marriage. When word spread about the investigation, neighbors volunteered to testify about the children's obvious well-being and the family's positive reputation in the community. Dr. Patterson offered to provide a medical report documenting the children's excellent health and the quality of care they'd received during Hope's illness. Mrs. Thompson volunteered to speak about the children's educational progress and their integration into community activities. Even the bank president, who had initially been skeptical about Marcus's financial arrangements regarding the Harper property, offered to testify about the legal propriety of their business dealings. The children themselves proved to be their own best advocates. When Rebecca explained the situation and asked them to think about what they wanted to tell the inspector, their responses demonstrated the confidence and articulation that good care had helped them develop. "I want to tell him about how Miss Rebecca saved Hope's life when she was sick," Catherine said with the quiet intensity that had replaced her former fearfulness, "and how she taught me to read books that Papa never could have afforded." Martha, now 13 and increasingly capable, offered practical support. "Miss Rebecca, I can show the inspector our household records, the meal plans, the education schedules. I can prove that we're better organized than most families twice our size." The twins had their own ideas about demonstrating their well-being. "We could show him the horses," Joseph suggested. "Mr. Marcus has been teaching us everything about breeding and training. We know more about ranch work than most grown men." Samuel's contribution was the most significant. As the oldest, his testimony would carry the most weight with any inspector trying to understand the children's actual circumstances versus the accusations being made against Rebecca and Marcus. "I'll tell him the truth," Samuel said simply. "That you and Mr. Marcus saved us from starving to death in a burned cabin. That we've learned more in 1 year here than we learned in our whole lives before. And that anyone who tries to take us away from our family will have to fight me personally." Rebecca felt tears threaten as she listened to the children's fierce loyalty and clear understanding of their own well-being. Whatever challenges the inspector might present, the children themselves would provide the most compelling evidence of the family's success. Harold Thornton arrived on a Thursday morning in a hired carriage that suggested both official authority and personal prosperity. He was a thin man in his 50s with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors and the suspicious expression of someone who expected to find fault with whatever he investigated. Rebecca met him at the front door wearing her best dress and the confident bearing she'd developed through months of managing complex household operations. "Mr. Thornton, welcome to our home. We're prepared to provide whatever information you need for your evaluation." Thornton's assessment of the house began immediately, his eyes cataloging details that he recorded in a leather-bound notebook. Rebecca could see him noting the cleanliness, the adequate furnishings, the evidence of prosperity and careful management that characterized every aspect of their domestic arrangements. "Mrs. Whitman," he said formally, "I'll need to interview you and your husband separately. Examine the children's living conditions, review household records, and speak with each child individually about their circumstances." "Of course," Rebecca replied smoothly. "We have all relevant documents prepared, and the children are available at your convenience. Would you like to begin with a tour of their rooms and the educational facilities?" The tour revealed a household that exceeded territorial standards for child care in every measurable category. Each child had adequate personal space, clean clothing, proper bedding, and access to educational materials that most frontier families couldn't afford. The kitchen and dining areas demonstrated food security that was obvious even to casual observation. Thornton's interview with Rebecca was thorough but revealed his underlying assumptions about her motivations. "Mrs. Whitman, you arrived in Clearwater Valley as a mail-order bride intending to marry Thomas Harper. When he died, you immediately married the wealthiest rancher in the county and assumed responsibility for 7 children who had no legal connection to you. Can you explain this sequence of events?" Rebecca had anticipated this line of questioning and answered with the directness that had served her well in previous challenges. "Mr. Thornton, I found 7 starving children living in a burned cabin with no resources to survive the approaching winter. I had a choice between abandoning them to likely death or taking responsibility for their welfare. I chose to honor the commitment I'd made when I decided to come west and build a family. And your marriage to Marcus Whitman was motivated purely by concern for these children?" Rebecca considered her answer carefully, knowing that complete honesty would serve her better than any attempt at deception. "My marriage to Marcus was motivated by practical considerations that benefited everyone involved. He needed a partner to help manage his ranch operations. I needed security and resources to care for 7 children. The children needed a stable home with adequate provisions. Our arrangement solved all of these problems." Thornton made notes that Rebecca couldn't read from her position across his desk. "And you expect me to believe that this convenient arrangement is in the children's best interests?" "I expect you to evaluate the evidence," Rebecca replied calmly. "Interview the children about their health, their education, their daily routines, their emotional well-being. Examine our household records, our financial arrangements, our community standing. Judge us by results rather than assumptions." The individual interviews with the children proved to be the turning point in Thornton's evaluation. Whatever preconceptions he brought to Clearwater Valley couldn't survive direct contact with 7 articulate, confident, obviously healthy children who spoke about their current circumstances with genuine enthusiasm. Hope, now 5 and bubbling with personality, charmed him completely by explaining her daily routine and showing off her reading skills. Catherine demonstrated the confidence she'd gained by discussing her favorite books and her plans for further education. The twins competed to explain ranch operations with knowledge that impressed even Thornton's skeptical assessment. Martha's interview showcased domestic skills and family loyalty that would have been remarkable in someone twice her age. Samuel's discussion of his apprenticeship with Marcus and his plans for eventually managing the Harper portion of the combined ranch demonstrated maturity and opportunity that no institutional setting could have provided. But the most compelling evidence came when Thornton asked each child privately whether they felt safe, whether they wanted to remain with Rebecca and Marcus, and whether they had any complaints about their current circumstances. The unanimous response was a resounding affirmation of their family bonds and fierce determination to remain together. Even David, who still spoke rarely, managed to tell Thornton clearly that Rebecca and Marcus were the best parents he'd ever had and that anyone who tried to take him away would be making a terrible mistake. Thornton's interview with Marcus focused on financial arrangements and legal documentation, areas where Marcus's meticulous record-keeping and conservative Business practices provided unassailable evidence of propriety. The property arrangements, inheritance protections, and household management systems demonstrated planning that prioritized the children's long-term interests above any personal gain. Mr. Whitman, Thornton said after reviewing ledgers that documented every aspect of their financial arrangements, these records indicate that you've invested significantly more in the Harper children's welfare than you could ever hope to recover. Why would you assume such financial responsibility for children who have no legal connection to you? Marcus's answer was characteristically direct. Because they needed a family, and Rebecca and I needed children to make our ranch into a true home. The financial investment will pay dividends in the kind of family life that makes hard work worthwhile. The community interviews that followed provided additional evidence of the family's positive reputation and the children's obvious well-being. Dr. Patterson's medical report documented not just adequate health care, but exceptional nutrition and development that exceeded territorial averages. Mrs. Thompson's educational assessment showed academic progress that surpassed most frontier children's achievements. By the end of his 3-day evaluation, Harold Thornton faced evidence that completely contradicted the accusations that had prompted his investigation. Instead of finding child endangerment, he discovered exceptional care. Instead of fraudulent arrangements, he found legal documentation that protected everyone's interests. Instead of unhappy children being exploited for financial gain, he found a thriving family that exceeded territorial standards in every measurable category. On his final evening in Clearwater Valley, Thornton requested a private meeting with Rebecca and Marcus to discuss his preliminary findings. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitman," he began formally, "I came here expecting to find evidence supporting serious allegations about child welfare and fraudulent marriage arrangements. Instead, I've found one of the most successful family situations I've encountered in 15 years of territorial child welfare work." Rebecca felt relief flood through her, but she maintained her composure while waiting for Thornton's complete assessment. "The children are obviously thriving," he continued. "Their health, education, emotional development, and future prospects all exceed what they could expect in any institutional setting. Your household management demonstrates exceptional competence. Your financial arrangements show proper legal documentation, and your community reputation indicates that this marriage represents genuine partnership rather than fraudulent convenience." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "What about Edmund Harper's allegations?" Thornton's expression grew stern. "Mr. Harper's motivations appear to be financial rather than genuine concern for his brother's children. My investigation suggests he's interested in challenging property arrangements that he believes should benefit him rather than the children. His allegations are not supported by evidence." Rebecca felt the last knot of tension dissolve from her shoulders. "What happens now?" "I'll file a report with the territorial government recommending that no further action be taken regarding the Harper children's custody. Your family arrangements should continue without interference." Thornton paused, then added with what might have been admiration, "Mrs. Whitman, you've accomplished something remarkable here. These children are fortunate to have found someone with your determination and capabilities." As Thornton's carriage disappeared down the valley road the next morning, Rebecca stood on the front porch surrounded by the 7 children who had become her own through choice, determination, and love that had grown stronger through every challenge they'd faced together. The investigation that had threatened to destroy their family had instead provided official validation of what they'd known all along. They belonged together. They were stronger united than they could ever be apart. And they had built something worth fighting to protect. Samuel, now 15 and clearly on his way to becoming a capable ranch manager, voiced what they were all thinking. "Nobody's ever going to separate us again, are they, Miss Rebecca?" Rebecca looked around at the faces that had become as dear to her as if she'd given birth to each child herself, then at Marcus, whose partnership had made their family success possible. "No, Samuel, she said with absolute certainty. We're family now in every way that matters. And family stays together. 2 years after Harold Thornton's investigation validated their family structure, Rebecca stood in the parlor of the new Harper house, watching Martha pin the final touches on a wedding dress that rivaled anything available in Denver's finest shops. At 17, Martha had grown into a capable young woman whose upcoming marriage to the banker's son represented everything Thomas Harper had dreamed of for his children: security, respectability, and genuine love that had developed naturally rather than from desperation. "Miss Rebecca," Martha said, using the name she'd never quite abandoned, despite years of calling Marcus Papa Marcus, "I can't believe this is really happening. 3 years ago, I thought I'd spend my life taking care of my siblings and never have a chance for my own family." Rebecca adjusted the delicate lace veil that she'd ordered from Chicago as Martha's wedding gift, remembering the hollow-cheeked girl who had tried so desperately to mother 6 younger children while slowly starving in a burned cabin. The transformation was complete in ways that went far beyond physical health and proper clothing. Martha had developed the confidence and skills that would serve her well as a banker's wife and future community leader. "Your father would be so proud," Rebecca said softly, meaning it completely. "He dreamed of giving all of you the opportunity to choose your own futures rather than simply surviving whatever circumstances forced upon you." The wedding preparations had become a community celebration that showcased how thoroughly the Harper children had integrated into Clearwater Valley society. Samuel, now 18 and managing the restored Harper Ranch as a profitable subsidiary of the Whitman operation, would give his sister away. The twins, at 15, had grown into skilled horsemen whose breeding program was attracting buyers from 3 territories. Catherine had become the most accomplished student in the county school, while David's quiet intelligence had found expression in mechanical innovations that improved ranch operations throughout the valley. Little Hope, now 7 and anything but little, served as flower girl with the fearless confidence that had made her a favorite among the ranch hands and a terror among the chickens she insisted on naming and treating as pets. But the wedding also marked a bittersweet milestone. The first of the Harper children to leave the family home they'd all fought so hard to preserve. Martha's departure would change the household dynamics that had defined Rebecca's married life and challenge her to redefine her role as the children gradually established their own independent lives. Marcus found Rebecca in the kitchen after the wedding ceremony, where she was supervising the cleanup from a reception that had fed half the county. His approach had the careful quality that indicated he wanted to discuss something significant, and Rebecca braced herself for whatever serious conversation was coming. "Beautiful wedding," he said, settling into the chair that had become his regular spot for their evening planning sessions. Martha looked radiant, and young Jameson seemed appropriately nervous for someone marrying the most capable woman in the territory. Rebecca smiled at his assessment, which captured Martha's character perfectly. "She managed that bank's books better than anyone they've ever employed, and she probably revolutionized their approach to customer service within 6 months." Marcus chuckled, but his expression grew more serious as he continued. "Rebecca, we need to talk about what comes next. With Martha married and Samuel essentially running his own operation, our household is changing. The children who needed our protection are becoming adults who can contribute to the community's welfare." Rebecca had been thinking along similar lines but hadn't quite formulated her thoughts into concrete plans. "What are you suggesting?" "That we expand our purpose beyond just our own family," Marcus said, pulling out a letter that Rebecca recognized as official correspondence. "I've been in contact with territorial officials about establishing a formal placement program for orphaned children. There are dozens of children throughout Montana Territory who need what we provided for the Harper family: security, education, and the chance to develop into contributing adults." The proposal was ambitious in scope and challenging in execution, But it also represented a natural evolution of everything Rebecca had learned about managing complex households and developing children's potential. They had proven their capability. With 7 children under desperate circumstances, how many more could they help if they approached the work systematically? What would that look like in practice? Rebecca asked, her organizational mind already beginning to work through logistics and requirements. Marcus spread out documents that showed he'd been planning this conversation for months. We'd partner with territorial authorities to identify children who need placement, provide temporary care while evaluating their individual needs, and either integrate them into our own household or help place them with other suitable families. Throughout the territory, the scope was staggering, but Rebecca found herself energized rather than overwhelmed by the challenge. We'd need additional buildings, more staff, expanded educational facilities, and probably legal authority to make placement decisions. All manageable, Marcus replied, if we approach it as a business enterprise rather than a charity operation. The territorial government would provide funding, other ranching families would contribute resources, and we'd develop sustainable systems rather than depending on individual generosity. Rebecca studied the preliminary plans that Marcus had obviously spent considerable time developing. The proposed expansion would transform their ranch into something between a school and a temporary home, providing specialized care for children with various backgrounds and needs, while maintaining the family atmosphere that had proven so successful with the Harper children. Marcus, she said slowly, this would change everything about how we live. Are you certain you want to take on this kind of responsibility? His answer revealed depths of purpose that explained why their practical marriage had evolved into something much deeper than either had originally expected. Rebecca, these past 3 years have been the most meaningful of my life. Not just because of our partnership, but because we've proven that determined adults can change children's futures in ways that ripple through entire communities. I can't think of any better use for the resources and knowledge we've accumulated. The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, as they explored implications and possibilities for expanding their mission beyond their own family. Rebecca found herself excited by challenges that would utilize every skill she'd developed while pushing her to learn new techniques for child development, educational programming, and community organization. The decision to establish the Clearwater Valley Children's Placement Program marked the beginning of Rebecca's transformation from successful ranch wife to recognized expert in child welfare throughout Montana Territory. The program's first year brought 12 children of various ages and backgrounds, each requiring individualized approaches that tested Rebecca's growing expertise in child psychology and educational theory. Some children arrived with traumatic backgrounds that required patient rehabilitation. Others came with educational deficits that demanded specialized tutoring. Still others brought behavioral challenges that tested everyone's patience and creativity. But all of them benefited from the stable environment and individual attention that Rebecca and Marcus had learned to provide. The program's success attracted attention from territorial officials, neighboring communities, and families throughout the region who were struggling with their own child welfare challenges. Rebecca found herself consulted on placement decisions, invited to speak at territorial conferences, and recognized as an authority on frontier child development. But the most meaningful validation came from the children themselves. Samuel's management of the Harper Ranch had become a model for young ranchers throughout the territory. Martha's marriage and community involvement demonstrated the kind of adult development that proper childhood care could foster. The twins' innovations in horse breeding contributed to the regional economy while showcasing the practical education they'd received. Catherine's academic achievements earned her a scholarship to study teaching in Denver, with plans to return and help expand the program's educational components. David's mechanical innovations had been adopted by ranchers across 3 territories, proving that quiet children often possessed extraordinary capabilities when given proper encouragement. even hope, still young but clearly following in her siblings' footsteps. Showed the confidence and competence that characterized children who'd grown up feeling secure and valued. The third anniversary of Rebecca's arrival in Clearwater Valley was marked by a community celebration that honored not just her personal transformation, but the ripple effects of her decision to take responsibility for 7 starving children in a burned cabin. The Clearwater Valley Children's Placement Program had successfully placed 43 children in permanent homes, established educational standards that influenced territorial policy, and created a model that was being replicated in other frontier communities. Sheriff Mitchell, now retired but still influential in community affairs, offered the toast that best captured Rebecca's impact on their region. 3 years ago, Rebecca Walsh arrived in Clearwater Valley as a stranger looking for a new life. Today, Rebecca Whitman stands as one of the most important citizens in Montana Territory, not because of what she's achieved for herself, but because of what she's made possible for children who had no other champions. Rebecca accepted the community's recognition with the grace that had characterized her approach to every challenge, but her mind was already focused on future possibilities rather than past achievements. The territorial governor had approached her about establishing similar programs in other regions. Universities were requesting her input on child welfare curriculum, and families from as far away as California were seeking her advice about adoption and child development. But the most significant development was personal rather than professional. That evening, after the community celebration had ended and the children were settled in their various homes and dormitories, Rebecca found herself alone with Marcus for the first time in months. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Thomas Harper hadn't died?" she asked, settling beside him on the porch where they'd shared so many evening conversations about ranch management and family concerns. Marcus considered the question seriously, as he did all hypothetical discussions that touched on their life together. "I think you would have been reasonably happy as Thomas's wife, and his children would have been adequately cared for. But I don't think you would have discovered the capabilities you've developed, or found the purpose that drives everything you do now." Rebecca nodded, recognizing the truth in his assessment. "I came west looking for security and respectability. I found something much more valuable, the knowledge that I could make a difference in ways I'd never imagined possible." Marcus reached for her hand with the easy affection that had developed between them over years of shared challenges and mutual respect. "Rebecca, you've exceeded every expectation I had when I proposed our arrangement. But more than that, you've become someone I never expected to find a true partner in building something that matters beyond our own comfort." The words carried weight that went beyond professional admiration or grateful acknowledgement. Over 3 years of working together, facing crises together, and building a family together, Rebecca and Marcus had developed the kind of deep companionship that sustained the most successful marriages: respect, shared purpose, genuine affection, and the comfortable intimacy that came from knowing someone completely. "Marcus," Rebecca said, voicing thoughts she'd been considering for months, "I want you to know that what we've built together, it's become much more than the practical arrangement we originally agreed to. I love the life we've created. I love the work we're doing, and—" she paused, surprised by her own boldness. "And I love you, not just as a partner, but as the man who made all of this possible." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Rebecca wondered if she'd overstepped boundaries that he preferred to maintain. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same honesty that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "I love you too, Rebecca. Differently than I loved Sarah, but no less deeply. What we have is based on choosing each other every day, on building something together rather than just sharing the same space. It's a mature love that's proven itself through every challenge we've faced." As they sat together watching stars emerge over the valley that had become their home and their life's work, Rebecca reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate mail order bride to territorial authority on child welfare. The woman who had arrived in Clearwater Valley with nothing but a carpetbag and desperate hope had become someone who influenced policy, changed lives, and built lasting institutions that would benefit future generations, but more than professional success or community recognition. Rebecca had found something she'd never dared to hope for: a true partnership with someone who respected her capabilities, supported her ambitions, and loved her for exactly who she had chosen to become. The burned cabin where she'd first found 7 starving children had been rebuilt into a beautiful home where Samuel and his new wife were starting their own family. The Clearwater Valley Children's Placement Program continued to expand, providing hope and opportunity for children throughout the territory. The community that had welcomed a stranger in desperate circumstances had become a model for frontier cooperation and child welfare, and Rebecca Whitman, formerly Rebecca Walsh, had discovered that sometimes the greatest transformations came not from finding what you thought you wanted, but from having the courage to become what the world needed you to be. As she and Marcus planned for tomorrow's challenges and next year's expansion of their program, Rebecca knew that her greatest adventures still lay ahead. There were more children to help, more families to build, more communities to influence, and more ways to prove that determined love could overcome any obstacle and transform any circumstance. The mail-order bride who had once been abandoned and desperate had become a woman who would never abandon others in need. And that transformation had made all the difference, not just for her, but for everyone whose life she touched along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.